The Goiânia Accident. In the heart of Goiânia, Brazil, the year 1987 was unfolding with a sense of normalcy, unaware that a tragedy of catastrophic proportions was about to be unleashed. A series of seemingly innocuous decisions and a moment of innocent curiosity would set the stage for one of the deadliest radiological accidents in history. It began with an abandoned building, a forgotten radiotherapy clinic that had closed its doors years before. The Instituto Goiano de Radioterapia had once been a vital medical facility, treating cancer patients with the help of a machine that used cesium-137, a radioactive isotope. When the clinic shut down, the equipment was abandoned, and with it, the source of radiation was left behind, a sealed container containing the cesium-137 capsule. The clinic's closure had left it a hollow, decaying shell, neglected and almost forgotten. Inside, however, one relic of the past remained: the radioactive container, hidden away and collecting dust in a dark, forgotten corner. On September 13th, two men, Roberto and his friend, were wandering through the abandoned building in search of scrap metal and anything of value. They had no idea of the danger that lay waiting for them. The building, though neglected, was an area often frequented by people looking for discarded materials, and in its decrepit state, it was easy to overlook what lay hidden in plain sight. Roberto and his friend stumbled upon the container, noticing its unusual shape and weight. Curiosity led them to pry it open. At first, they didn't know what they had discovered, but inside, the faint glow of the cesium-137 capsule caught their attention. The glowing blue material was unlike anything they had seen before. It shimmered softly, almost mesmerizing in its beauty. They had no way of knowing that the material they were looking at was lethal, highly radioactive, and capable of killing or severely harming anyone who came into contact with it. The two men, unaware of the danger, decided to take the container with them. Roberto, intrigued by the glow and believing it might be valuable, brought it back to his house. The discovery spread quickly. Roberto showed the container to his family, his wife, children, and friends. None of them knew what it was, but the glowing powder intrigued them. It was beautiful, and they couldn't resist touching it, fascinated by its eerie light. Soon, the family began to scrape off pieces of the powder, packing it into jars or smearing it on their skin. To them, it was an oddity, something rare, almost magical. Some even began to believe it might have beneficial properties, rubbing it on their skin in the hopes it might heal or provide some sort of mystical benefit. Others simply admired the glow, showing it off to friends, eager to share the bizarre find. Before long, the material was no longer confined to Roberto's home. Word spread, and other people from the neighborhood came by to see the glowing powder, curious about its strange allure. Those who visited Roberto's home were handed small amounts of the substance, taking it with them to their own houses. It was passed hand to hand, from one family to the next. The glowing powder was treated as an odd, rare souvenir, but no one had any understanding of the danger it posed. There was no warning, no thought to what the material could do. It was beautiful, almost magical, and it was something people couldn't resist. The spread of the radioactive cesium-137 reached more than just a few homes. It went far beyond Roberto's family and their immediate circle. The substance was handed off to neighbors and friends who were captivated by its glow. People didn't know how harmful it was, and many of them handled it without any protective gear, completely unaware that they were exposing themselves to a deadly level of radiation. For days, the people who came into contact with the powder remained unaware of the invisible danger they were carrying with them. The material had attached itself to their clothes, their hands, and even their homes. It had spread quietly, almost undetectably, and it wasn't long before the first signs of sickness began to appear. At first, the symptoms were subtle: mild headaches, nausea, dizziness, and fatigue. Those who had been in close contact with the glowing material began to feel a vague sense of unwellness. But these initial signs were dismissed as coincidence. It wasn't until a young girl from Roberto's family, who had played with the powder, developed severe skin lesions that the situation began to escalate. Her condition worsened rapidly. Her skin began to blister and swell, and she grew increasingly weak and disoriented. Roberto and his family, still oblivious to the cause, rushed her to the hospital. But by then, it was too late. Other people who had handled the powder began to show similar symptoms. Those who had rubbed it on their skin began to develop blisters and painful rashes. Hair started falling out. The radiation was wreaking havoc on their cells, and it was becoming clear that something catastrophic was happening, though no one could immediately identify the cause. As more and more people fell ill, it became evident that the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. The hospitals in Goiânia were overwhelmed, their limited resources quickly exhausted by the influx of patients suffering from symptoms that baffled doctors. Those who had been exposed to the radiation began to develop more severe effects: internal bleeding, organ failure, and even more blistering skin lesions. The doctors had no clear explanation at first. The symptoms were like nothing they had seen before, and it wasn't until specialists from the National Nuclear Energy Commission, CNEN, were brought in that the truth was uncovered. Cesium-137, a radioactive substance, had been distributed across the city, and everyone who had come into contact with it was now at risk. By this time, it was too late to contain the damage. The radioactive material had spread beyond Roberto's home and the immediate neighborhood. It was in the dirt, in the homes, and on the clothes of the people who had handled the powder. The cesium-137 had quietly and invisibly seeped into the community, contaminating nearly 250 people, many of whom had no idea of the lethal danger they had been exposed to. The cleanup was a monumental and urgent task. Entire neighborhoods were quarantined, and people were evacuated from their homes. The government, in collaboration with the military, launched a massive decontamination effort. Streets were dug up, buildings were demolished, and contaminated homes were abandoned. Despite these efforts, the true scope of the disaster was not fully understood for days. People began to die. The victims, sick, helpless, and unaware of the invisible poison that had slowly destroyed their bodies, became part of a tragedy that would be remembered forever. 4 people ultimately died from radiation exposure, and many others were left with permanent damage to their health. The Goiânia Accident, as it became known, was a devastating example of how a series of careless actions and an innocent fascination could lead to a deadly disaster. What had started as a seemingly harmless discovery in an abandoned clinic had spiraled into one of the worst radiological accidents in history. The Goiânia Accident would forever haunt the city and serve as a chilling reminder of the dangers posed by radioactive materials when they are mishandled, ignored, or forgotten. The people of Goiânia would never forget the lesson learned in the most horrifying way. Radiation is a silent killer, one that cannot be seen, touched, or even smelled. It is a danger that lurks in the background, hidden from view, until it strikes with devastating force.